right now. First off, I should apologize for our president, Andrea Major. She was supposed to be coming in at 3 o'clock this afternoon from Florida, but hasn't arrived yet, so she asked me if I would host it. Just before I start, I'd remind you of next month's talk. That's on the 16th of November, and it's Percival Francis talking about the history of Junkanoo. So if you're interested in that, come out on the 16th of November, same time, 6 o'clock, 6:05. Now, our guest speaker tonight, I should tell you something about the Renaissance. In the Renaissance, people there had a vast knowledge of everything. And so our guest speaker falls into that category. He's a Renaissance man. I know that he's a lawyer. I know that he's very, very a member of the Greek community and can tell you anything about Greek history. I know he's a member of the Greek Church. I know that he's a staunch member of the Bahamas Humane Society and been so for many years and held important positions.
National Trust.
National Trust, not the Humane. Oh, yeah, the National Trust, sorry. Many, many years. He has a plot of land out at Adelaide and encourages schools and school children and camping trips for the Duke of Edinburgh Award. Yes, he got the General's Award now. And so a very, very involved man. He's here tonight to talk to us about rum, sugar and slavery. And so I'll introduce you to Pericles Maillis. Thank you.
Start to cough, you'll have to forgive me. Ladies and gentlemen, I actually entitled the talk Mercantilism and Colonial Origins, Sugar, Rum and Slavery, the Makings of Our World. And I wanted to preface it by reminding everybody the word history comes from the Greek word historia, which is the story. So it's not just Crocodile Dundee that has a story, and we need to get our people to understand that, hey, we are the great storytellers here. Secondly, to commend to you what my history teacher, who's 80 and coming to stay with me next week for 10 days, Enid Castle, drummed into our heads that you need to approach history with a spirit of intertemporal morality. You can't judge events and things and people as they did them back then with our own standards of today. You need to be at peace and look back and judge people by what the morality and the practices and the standards of the time were. Which doesn't mean that they were okay, but nevertheless, keep that in the back of your mind. And then I want to say that our history, and when I said our world, I'm speaking of the whole New World, including the Bahamas, but also the whole greater colonial world. And our history didn't start with the northward movement of Arawak Indians ahead of the Caribs, or they're reaching Hispaniola and Cuba and following the flight lines of white-crowned pigeons to each island of the Bahamas, eventually colonizing the whole thing. It didn't start with Columbus and the European discovery of at least this part of the New World. Both as a people made up of many people, we all come from somewhere and some part of the world. And all of us, therefore, have histories going way back to the beginning of time. But also, our region, our history didn't start here. It starts from distant places and distant events. And if you really want to understand our full history, you need to go way, way back. Now, how far back? Well, the most relevant, earliest date that I can pinpoint is 8,000 BC on the island of New Guinea, where the natives domesticated a grass species that produced a sugary, syrupy juice known as sugar cane. Then, way back then, that was to become one of the leading, dominating forces that created the New World. It spread to Polynesia, then to Indonesia, and then to Indochina and India. And when Alexander went to India, he said they had honey not made by bees. And the Indians learned to crystallize sugar into the pretty white sugar that we know today, 350 AD. All of that's in our history. The production of sugar was then left in the East for a while, and then after the Arab conquest with the rise of Islam, they spread sugar growing and took it to plantation level in Egypt, North Africa, Cyprus, when they took Spain and Portugal. And that westward movement of plantation growing of sugar, that's a deep part of our history of this part of the world. And then the spices of the East. For as long as people could remember, there were Arab traders, Indian traders, Greek traders that coasted along the Indian Ocean from the Red Sea. They stayed in sight of land, they anchored at night. And then in 118 AD, a Greek captain named Evdoxos, on his way back from India, coasting. It took 3 years to go and come by coasting. They found a shipwreck and a sailor floating amongst the wreckage. And normally people like that would be enslaved, but this man talked himself out of slavery by offering to teach them how to go and come from India with the monsoon winds. And that then led to 1-year voyages. And for the first time, huge amounts of spices from the east were coming to the Red Sea, across into the Mediterranean, and that started the European quest for spices. All of that deeply a part of our history. And then you have historical events. The fall of the western part of the Roman Empire by 300-400 AD, and the Dark Ages settling over Europe. The Eastern Empire lasted about 1,000 more years in its end. But before that, the rise of Islam, the Arabs taking over the whole of the Near East, the whole of North Africa, and cutting off the West from free access to those parts. The Silk Roads that came across Asia that they're now rebuilding, that got disrupted by the Tartars and the Mongols. At the same time, Marco Polo went and came and drove the West crazy with the stories of the riches of the East. All of that is in our history. And then you have to think about how the world emerged from the Dark Ages. Dr. Lawler mentions the Renaissance, well, the fall of Constantinople, and even before then, scholars and people were getting out. But all the knowledge and the manuscripts and many of the intelligentsia of the Byzantine Empire went across to Italy, University in Florence, and that started what we know as the Renaissance, and that's in our history. And at the same time, you have the never-ending conquest by Islam that went on way into the 1600s, seemed irreversible. And people like Columbus, whose family had trade links, and there's still people named Columbus on the island of Chios, which was a Genoese colony within sight of the mountains of Turkey. They all had the obsession to see whether they could get to the east by going to the West and bring the wealth, and from that wealth would come new crusades and so forth. All of that is in our history.
Because the world was flat then, right?
Pardon?
The world was flat.
Well, it had become flat again with the Dark Ages and too much church. But if you think about how the world gradually, and I say the world, I'm talking about our mother part of the world, as far as the colonization part went, Western Europe, the way some order came out of the Dark Ages, and not all in one place, and not all at one time, and they weren't the first, because much of the Byzantine Empire was organized in feudal land holdings. The land all belonged to the emperor, to the king. The king gave sections and provinces to dukes and governors and earls. They in turn turned over sections to the lesser nobility. They in turn had squires who had manors, smaller farms, and then on the manors were lots and lots of little tenant farms, and everybody paid, but not too much in money, in men for the army, in food, horses, equipment, trade goods. It wasn't a gold and currency world, it was a goods and services world. But out of it came order, out of it came a way of life that could feed a population. And that dream carried over to the New World. And people came for land so that they could have a farm if they were small, or they could have an estate or a hacienda if they were the younger landless sons of the nobility and so forth. And that was all part of our history. And then came this era of mercantilism. Now that word was not used, interestingly, until the mid-1700s. And there's no real definition for it. It was really a national and economic philosophy or group of ideas which developed in Western Europe as feudalism declined and cities became more powerful. Nation states emerged. The Spanish, they were, I suppose, amongst the first. They finished their Reconquista, taking the whole Iberian Peninsula back from the Moors in 1492 with the fall of Granada. And so they became a single nation state. Portugal, which was part of Iberia, also became, well, it had already become a single nation state with powerful interests in exploring. And they had already started going down the coast of Africa, voyage by voyage, coming back, recording what they found, establishing forts that would be a base for the next leapfrogging. And 1588, Bartolomé Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope and created a new sensation and a new urgency amongst the other jealous Europeans. England had the Wars of the Roses and unending civil wars, and wars with France, and France had its civil wars, but starting into at least by the mid 1500s, and certainly by the early 1600s, England, well, in the age of Elizabeth, had become a powerful nation state. France was a powerful, defined nation state. And the other player, the other who was to become a big player, were the Dutch. And they were, of course, subjects of the Spanish-ruled Habsburg Empire. And they had to fight long and horrible war of independence. But they eventually were free of the Spanish, and they became a powerful, rich little nation state. And there are other things, other factors that are part of our history, which I'll just quickly touch on, and then we go back to mercantilism. There's also the history of the Jewish people of the world. After Vespasian and the diaspora, there were Jewish populations all over the Roman and Byzantine empires. And then And as long as the Pax Romana held in the east, things were okay. There were large Jewish populations within the British Empire. The Romans had looked down on doctors and medicine, and that science was confined to Greek, Arab, and Jewish doctors. And so amongst the Jewish populations, you had men of science and men of learning from way, way back. And then there were historical events that caused eventually the expulsion of the Jewish populations from the Eastern Roman Empire. And there was one huge drifting up to the Black Sea colonies and another west to Spain. And in Spain, under the Moorish rules in the Golden Age of Cordoba, there were huge Sephardic Jewish populations in trade and commerce and science and so forth. And in the rest of Western Europe, the Jewish populations were not allowed to own land. And they were confined to living in cities and in ghettos, as they were called, or districts. And therefore they had to do commerce and trade and banking and science. They became the alchemists, partly for medicine, partly to learn how to make spirits, which were partly for medicine, partly for fun. And there was accumulations of capital. And in the end, the most liberal parts of Europe remained Spain until 1492, Portugal for a little longer, Holland. England itself didn't allow the settlement of Jews from the time of Edward I, except for Queen Elizabeth's doctor, until Oliver Cromwell came to power. But once he did, then that knowledge and that capital also became part of the British Empire. But the Dutch inherited, and after the Spanish Inquisition was set up, vast numbers of Sephardic Jews migrated east to Turkey. Others converted, and for a while were allowed into the New World, but as many as could got way away from the Spanish Inquisition, and Holland became a great center of refugees and capital. And in any event, they controlled the delta of the Rhine, and much of the trade of Europe had to go through there. And so they were a capital, huge capital center. And all of that is in our story. So now, as I said, feudalism was declining, cities, merchants, seaports, nation states, kings being influenced. And this mercantilist philosophy that emerged started to have form and substance and to be put into practice. It wasn't all new. If you have time to read a long and sometimes dreary book about the history of the Black Sea, it's called From Pericles, as my namesake, to Putin. And you want to learn about earlier colonizations, and you think we're all the first, how you have to vilify and get people to think of the natives of those regions as subhuman. The Greeks called them barbarians. And so it was justifiable to go, conquer, settle, enslave, and then build colonies so that the second and the third and the fourth and the fifth sons who weren't going to inherit the family farm could have a family estate and live and so forth. That had been going on around the Mediterranean world with the Phoenicians and the Greeks for 1,000 years before Christ, even longer.